The morning sun cast long shadows across the gardens of Windsor Castle as Catherine walked slowly along the familiar stone pathways. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ancient walls that had witnessed centuries of royal drama, but none quite like what was unfolding now. The Princess of Wales had always found solace in these gardens, where she could escape the constant scrutiny and pressure that came with her position. Today, however, even this peaceful sanctuary couldn't calm the storm raging in her heart. William stood at the window of his study, watching his wife from afar. He could see the weight she carried in the slump of her shoulders, the way she paused at every turn as if gathering strength for what lay ahead. The past months had been increasingly difficult for Catherine, and William felt helpless as he watched the woman he loved struggle with forces beyond their control. The tension had been building for weeks within the royal household. What had started as subtle disagreements about royal duties and protocols had escalated into something much more serious. Catherine had always been the steady one, the anchor that kept their family grounded even as the demands of royal life threatened to overwhelm them. But lately, William had noticed changes in her behavior that worried him deeply. Catherine had been spending more time alone, declining invitations to family gatherings, and speaking less during official meetings. Her usual warmth during public appearances seemed forced, and William could see the strain in her eyes even when she smiled for the cameras. The palace staff had begun to whisper among themselves, sensing that something was amiss with the usually composed princess. The breaking point had come during a particularly heated discussion about upcoming royal engagements. Catherine had expressed concerns about the increasing demands on their family, especially regarding their children's privacy and well-being. She had always been protective of George, Charlotte, and Louis, trying to give them as normal a childhood as possible despite their royal status. Queen Camilla, who had been present during that meeting, had made what many considered to be dismissive comments about Catherine's concerns. The exchange had been tense, with Catherine maintaining her composure despite the obvious frustration she felt. Later, when she and William were alone, Catherine had finally broken down. Expressing feelings that had been building up for months, she spoke about feeling trapped, about the constant pressure to be perfect, and about her fears for their children's future. Catherine had always known that marrying William meant accepting a life of service and sacrifice, but the reality had proven more challenging than she had anticipated. The relentless media attention, the rigid protocols, and the lack of privacy had taken their toll. William had tried to reassure her, promising to find ways to reduce the pressure and protect their family better, but Catherine seemed to have reached a decision that nothing could change. She talked about needing space, about questioning whether she was truly suited for this life, and about the impact her struggles might have on the monarchy itself. The conversation that night had lasted for hours, with both of them crying as they discussed their fears and frustrations. William had pleaded with Catherine to reconsider, reminding her of all the good they had accomplished together and the positive impact she had on people around the world. But Catherine seemed resolute, explaining that she needed to step back for her own mental health and for the well-being of their children. Over the following days, Catherine had begun making arrangements that suggested she was planning something significant. She had private meetings with her personal staff, spent extra time with the children explaining that there might be some changes coming, and had long phone conversations with her family. William watched all of this with growing alarm, realizing that his wife was serious about whatever decision she had made. The palace staff noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. There were fewer joint appearances scheduled, and Catherine's private secretary had begun fielding unusual requests about clearing her calendar. Rumors started to circulate among the household staff, though no one dared to voice their suspicions openly. Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, had become regular visitors to the palace, something that hadn't gone unnoticed by other members of the royal family. They would arrive quietly and spend hours in private conversation with their daughter, their faces grave and concerned. William appreciated their support, but their presence also made the situation feel more real and immediate. The children had begun to sense that something was wrong, despite their parents' efforts to maintain normalcy around them. George, being the oldest, seemed particularly attuned to the tension in the household. He had started asking more questions about his mother's activities and why she seemed sad so often. Catherine had done her best to reassure him, but the strain was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Meanwhile, other members of the royal family had begun to take notice of the unusual dynamics. King Charles had requested several private meetings with William, expressing his concern about Catherine's state of mind and its potential impact on the monarchy. The conversations were delicate, as Charles tried to balance his role as both father and sovereign. Camilla's reaction to the situation had been notably different from Charles's approach. While the king showed genuine concern for Catherine's well-being, Camilla seemed more focused on the potential embarrassment and disruption that any dramatic action might cause. Her comments during family meetings often centered on maintaining appearances and minimizing scandal, rather than addressing the underlying issues that were causing Catherine such distress. The contrast between their approaches had not been lost on Catherine, who felt increasingly isolated within the royal family structure. She had always maintained cordial relations with Camilla, but the recent interactions had revealed fundamental differences in their values and priorities. This realization had only strengthened Catherine's resolve to make whatever changes she felt were necessary. As the days passed, Catherine's preparations became more apparent to those closest to her. She had begun organizing her personal belongings, creating detailed notes about ongoing charitable projects, and having what seemed like farewell conversations with longtime staff members. The emotional weight of these interactions was evident to everyone involved. William found himself caught between his love for Catherine and his duty to the crown. He understood her struggles and respected her need to prioritize her mental health, but he also feared the consequences of any dramatic action she might take. The pressure of trying to support his wife while managing his own royal responsibilities was taking its toll on him as well. The media had begun to pick up on subtle signs that all was not well within the royal household. Photographers noted the decreased number of joint public appearances, and royal correspondents started speculating about possible reasons for the change in schedule. The palace's press office worked overtime to deflect questions and maintain the appearance of normalcy. Catherine's charitable work, which had always been a source of joy and purpose for her, began to feel like another burden. She worried about letting down the organizations that depended on her support, but she also recognized that she couldn't continue to give to others when she felt so depleted herself. The guilt associated with these feelings only added to her emotional turmoil. The sleepless nights had become routine for both Catherine and William. They would lie awake discussing their options, exploring every possible solution that might allow them to stay together while addressing Catherine's needs. But each conversation seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. Something fundamental had to change, and that change was going to be painful for everyone involved. As Catherine continued her solitary walks through the palace gardens, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. From her middle-class upbringing to becoming one of the most photographed women in the world, the transformation had been dramatic and, at times, overwhelming. She thought about the young woman who had fallen in love with a prince and wondered if that person would have made different choices knowing what lay ahead. The weight of public expectation had always been heavy, but recent events had made it feel unbearable. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every fashion choice analyzed, and every interaction with her children photographed and discussed. Catherine had tried to maintain her dignity and grace under pressure, but the constant attention had begun to feel suffocating. Her relationship with William remained strong at its core, but the stress of their situation had created new tensions between them. They found themselves disagreeing more often, not because their fundamental values had changed, but because they were both exhausted and struggling to cope with the pressure. These disagreements, while minor in themselves, added to Catherine's sense that everything in her life was becoming increasingly difficult. The decision that Catherine was contemplating would affect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she cared about. She understood the potential consequences for William, for their children, and for the monarchy itself. But she also knew that continuing on her current path might lead to an even worse outcome for everyone involved. As the sun began to set over Windsor Castle, Catherine made her way back toward the main building, knowing that the most difficult conversations of her life lay ahead. The choice she was facing seemed impossible, but she also knew that avoiding it would only make things worse. The time had come to be honest about her limitations and to prioritize her family's well-being, even if it meant making decisions that others would find difficult to understand or accept. The next morning arrived with an unusual chill that seemed to penetrate even the warmest rooms of the palace. Catherine had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling while William tossed and turned beside her. They had agreed the previous evening that today would be the day she would have the conversation that would change everything. Catherine dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress that had always made her feel confident. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she tried to summon the strength she would need for what lay ahead. Her reflection showed a woman who had aged beyond her years, the stress of recent months evident in the lines around her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. William was already downstairs when Catherine made her way to the breakfast room. He looked up as she entered, and she could see the same exhaustion in his face that she felt in her own body. They ate in relative silence, both knowing that this might be one of their last quiet mornings together for a very long time. The children were spending the day with Catherine's parents, an arrangement that had been made to ensure they would be away from the palace during what was sure to be a difficult day. Catherine had hugged them extra tightly that morning, breathing in their familiar scents and trying to memorize every detail of their sleepy faces. At 10 o'clock, Catherine made her way to the formal sitting room where she had requested a meeting with King Charles. The room felt especially grand and intimidating today, with its high ceilings and portraits of previous monarchs looking down from the walls. Charles was already waiting when she arrived, his expression grave but kind. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Catherine's life. She explained her struggles with honesty and vulnerability, describing the toll that royal life had taken on her mental health and her concerns about the impact on her children. Charles listened without interruption, his face showing genuine concern for her well-being. When Catherine finally revealed her intention to step back from royal duties temporarily, Charles's response was measured and thoughtful. He expressed his understanding of her position while also outlining the challenges that such a decision would create for the monarchy. The discussion was frank but respectful, with both parties acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Charles had always admired Catherine's dedication and the positive impact she had on the royal family's public image. Her work with mental health charities, children's causes, and her natural ability to connect with people had made her one of the most beloved members of the royal family. The thought of losing her contribution, even temporarily, was deeply concerning to him. However, Charles also recognized that forcing Catherine to continue in a role that was causing her such distress would ultimately be counterproductive for everyone involved. He had learned from past royal crises that ignoring mental health concerns could lead to much more serious problems down the line. His response was compassionate, though he also needed to consider the broader implications. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, during which they discussed possible alternatives and compromises. Charles suggested reducing Catherine's official duties, providing additional support staff, and exploring ways to better protect the family's privacy. Catherine appreciated his willingness to find solutions, but she had already concluded that minor adjustments would not be sufficient to address her needs. By the time their conversation ended, Charles understood that Catherine's decision was firm. While he was disappointed, he also respected her courage in being honest about her limitations. They agreed that the next step would be to discuss the situation with other senior members of the royal family and to begin planning how to manage the transition. Word of the meeting spread quickly through the palace staff, who were adept at reading the subtle signs of significant royal developments. The unusually long duration of the discussion and the serious expressions on both faces when they emerged from the sitting room told a story that everyone could interpret. Later that afternoon, Camilla arrived at the palace for what had been scheduled as a routine family meeting. However, the agenda had clearly changed, and the atmosphere was tense from the moment she walked through the doors. Her usual confidence seemed slightly shaken as she sensed that something significant was happening. The meeting that followed included Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine. The discussion was formal and difficult, with each person struggling to balance personal feelings with institutional responsibilities. Catherine once again explained her position, this time with William's visible support, which helped validate her concerns. Camilla's reaction was notably different from Charles's earlier response. While she expressed understanding for Catherine's struggles, her primary focus seemed to be on the potential damage to the royal family's reputation and the disruption it would cause to carefully planned schedules and commitments. Her questions centered more on managing public perception than on addressing Catherine's well-being. The contrast between Camilla's approach and the more supportive responses from Charles and William was stark. Catherine felt that Camilla viewed her primarily as a problem to be managed, rather than as a person in distress who needed support. This perception, whether accurate or not, only reinforced Catherine's feeling that she was not truly understood by all members of the royal family. During a particularly tense moment in the discussion, Camilla made a comment about the importance of duty above personal feelings that struck Catherine as particularly insensitive given the circumstances. The remark was not explicitly cruel, but its timing and tone suggested a lack of empathy that was noted by everyone in the room. William's reaction to Camilla's comment was immediate and visible. His face flushed with anger, and he had to take a moment to compose himself before responding. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, as it became clear that there were fundamental disagreements about how to handle the situation. Catherine watched William struggle to maintain his composure and felt a wave of love and gratitude for his support. Throughout this entire ordeal, he had stood by her even when it meant challenging other members of his family. His loyalty meant everything to her, even as she knew that her decision would cause him pain. The meeting eventually ended without a clear resolution, but with an agreement to reconvene the following day after everyone had time to process the discussion. As the group dispersed, Catherine noticed what appeared to be a slight smirk on Camilla's face as she gathered her papers. The expression was subtle, but it suggested a level of satisfaction that seemed inappropriate given the gravity of the situation. William noticed the same expression and felt a surge of protective anger toward his wife. He had always tried to maintain good relations with his stepmother, but her apparent lack of genuine concern for Catherine's well-being was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The smirk, whether intentional or not, felt like a final insult to his wife's suffering. That evening, Catherine and William had dinner alone in their private quarters. The conversation was emotional and raw, with both of them expressing their frustrations and fears about what lay ahead. Catherine apologized repeatedly for the pain she was causing, while William assured her that he supported whatever decision she felt was necessary for her well-being. They talked late into the night about their children and how to minimize the impact of Catherine's decision on their lives. Both parents were determined to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis from the worst aspects of the media attention that was sure to follow. They began making plans for increased security and discussed the possibility of temporary relocation to ensure the children's safety and privacy. The weight of their conversation was enormous, as they were essentially planning the dismantling of the life they had built together. Every detail had to be considered, from the practical aspects of Catherine's withdrawal from public duties to the emotional support their children would need during the transition. Catherine's personal staff had been informed of the general situation and were working discreetly to prepare for whatever announcement would eventually be made. The loyalty and professionalism of these individuals was evident in their handling of the sensitive situation as they balanced their concern for Catherine with their responsibility to the institution. Meanwhile, the media had begun to pick up on subtle signs that something significant was happening within the royal household. Royal correspondents were asking more pointed questions about future engagements, and photographers were noting the decreased visibility of Catherine in recent weeks. The palace's press office was working hard to maintain normal operations while preparing for whatever announcement would eventually need to be made. As the night wore on, Catherine found herself thinking about all the people who would be affected by her decision. Beyond her immediate family, there were charitable organizations, staff members, and members of the public who had come to rely on her support and presence. The guilt she felt about potentially disappointing these individuals was almost overwhelming. William held her as she cried, offering what comfort he could while dealing with his own grief about the changes that were coming. They both knew that their relationship would survive this crisis, but they also understood that their lives would be fundamentally different moving forward. The fairy tale aspects of their romance had given way to a much more complex and challenging reality. The next morning brought new challenges, as news of the previous day's meetings had begun to circulate among senior palace officials. Each conversation brought new complications and considerations, making it clear that Catherine's decision would have far-reaching consequences that went well beyond her personal situation. Despite the pressure and complexity, Catherine felt a sense of relief at having finally been honest about her struggles. For too long, she had tried to maintain a facade of perfect adjustment to royal life, but that pretense had become unsustainable. Whatever happened next, at least she would be living authentically, rather than performing a role that no longer fitted her needs. As she prepared for another day of difficult conversations and decisions, Catherine drew strength from William's unwavering support, and from the knowledge that she was making the best decision she could for her family's long-term well-being. The path ahead was uncertain and frightening, but it also offered the possibility of healing and renewal that had seemed impossible while she remained trapped in an unsustainable situation. The third day dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over the palace. Catherine woke before sunrise, her body still adjusting to the emotional exhaustion of the previous days. She could hear William breathing beside her, but she knew from his restless movements that he was also struggling to find peace in sleep. Today would mark the beginning of the most difficult phase of Catherine's withdrawal from royal life. The decision had been made, the key family members had been informed, and now the practical aspects of her departure needed to be implemented. Each step felt monumental, carrying weight that seemed almost impossible to bear. The morning began with a private meeting between Catherine and her children. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been brought back to the palace early so that their mother could explain what would be happening in the coming weeks. The conversation was heartbreaking, as Catherine tried to find age-appropriate ways to explain complex adult emotions and decisions. George, at his young age, seemed to understand more than his siblings about the gravity of the situation. His questions were thoughtful and showed a maturity that both impressed and saddened Catherine. She assured him that her love for him and his siblings had not changed, but that she needed some time to feel better so she could be the best mother possible. Charlotte clung to her mother throughout the conversation, sensing the emotional weight even if she couldn't fully comprehend the details. Her innocent questions about when things would return to normal broke Catherine's heart as she realized that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Louis, being the youngest, seemed less affected by the immediate conversation, but more attuned to the emotional atmosphere around him. He stayed close to both parents throughout the day, as if sensing that his family needed extra comfort during this difficult time. After speaking with the children, Catherine met with her private secretary to discuss the practical aspects of stepping back from her royal duties. The list of commitments that needed to be canceled or transferred to other family members was extensive, representing months of careful planning that would now need to be undone. Each canceled engagement felt like another small goodbye, as Catherine realized how many people she would be disappointing with her decision. The charitable organizations that had relied on her patronage, the communities that had prepared for her visits, and the individuals who had hoped to meet her all represented connections that were being severed. The palace staff who had worked closely with Catherine were devastated by the news. Many of them had developed genuine affection for her over the years, appreciating her kindness and consideration in her daily interactions with them. The thought of her departure felt like losing a member of their extended family. Meanwhile, preparations were being made for an official announcement that would need to be carefully crafted to explain Catherine's decision without revealing too many personal details. The communications team worked tirelessly to find language that would be truthful, but also protective of the family's privacy. The media speculation had intensified significantly, with royal correspondents sensing that a major story was developing. Photographers were stationed outside the palace around the clock, hoping to capture images that might provide clues about what was happening. The increased attention only added to the stress that Catherine was already experiencing. King Charles spent much of the day in meetings with senior advisors, discussing how to minimize the impact of Catherine's departure on the monarchy's public image. While he remained supportive of her decision on a personal level, his role as sovereign required him to consider the institutional implications as well. The conversation with other senior royals had been scheduled for late afternoon, and as the time approached, Catherine felt her anxiety rising. She knew that not everyone would be as understanding as Charles had been, and she prepared herself for criticism and difficult questions. Prince Edward and Sophie arrived first, their expressions showing concern rather than judgment. They had always maintained a good relationship with Catherine, and their response to the news was supportive, focusing on her well-being rather than the inconvenience her decision might cause. Princess Anne's reaction was more complex, as she balanced her natural directness with genuine concern for Catherine's situation. Her questions were pointed but fair, and she offered practical advice about managing the transition period. Her respect for Catherine's honesty about her limitations was evident, even as she expressed concern about the precedent being set. However, it was Camilla's presence that created the most tension in the room. From the moment she arrived, her body language suggested disapproval and frustration rather than empathy. Her questions seemed designed more to highlight the problems Catherine's decision would create than to offer support or understanding. During the discussion, Camilla made several comments that struck others as particularly insensitive. She questioned whether Catherine had fully considered the impact on William's reputation and suggested that perhaps more effort should have been made to find solutions that didn't require such dramatic action. The most damaging moment came when Camilla, perhaps thinking she was being helpful, suggested that Catherine might benefit from learning to cope better with pressure, rather than running away from responsibility. The comment was followed by what several people in the room interpreted as a slight smirk, as if she was pleased with her own directness. William's reaction was immediate and intense. His face darkened with anger, and he struggled visibly to maintain his composure. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Camilla's words and William's obvious displeasure with her approach. Catherine herself remained calm outwardly, but those who knew her well could see the hurt in her eyes. The suggestion that she was somehow failing in her duty or taking the easy way out was particularly painful, given how much she had struggled with the decision and how much consideration she had given to its impact on others. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, with several family members clearly uncomfortable with Camilla's approach, but uncertain how to address it without creating an even larger conflict. Charles looked particularly troubled, caught between supporting his wife and protecting Catherine from further hurt. When the meeting finally ended, the damage had been done. Catherine left feeling more isolated than ever, despite the support she had received from most family members. Camilla's reaction had confirmed her worst fears about how some people would interpret her decision. William was furious and made no effort to hide his feelings as the group dispersed. His relationship with his stepmother had always been complicated, but her treatment of Catherine during such a vulnerable time felt like a betrayal that would be difficult to forgive. That evening, as news of the family meeting spread among palace staff, reports of the tension began to circulate. Several staff members had witnessed William's obvious anger and Camilla's apparent satisfaction, leading to gossip and speculation about the family dynamics at play. The contrast between the public image of royal family unity and the private reality of their disagreements was stark. For Catherine, this disconnect only reinforced her feeling that the gap between public expectation and personal reality had become too wide to bridge. As the day drew to a close, Catherine spent time writing letters to key individuals who would be affected by her decision. Each letter was carefully crafted to express her gratitude for their support, while explaining her need to step back from public duties. The process was emotionally draining, but necessary for her peace of mind. The children were settled for the night with extra bedtime stories and reassurances, as their parents tried to maintain as much normalcy as possible during this turbulent time. Both Catherine and William were acutely aware that their children's emotional well-being had to be the top priority throughout this transition. Later that night, Catherine and William reviewed the plans for the public announcement that would be made the following day. The statement had been revised multiple times to ensure it struck the right balance between honesty and privacy, acknowledging Catherine's need for space while avoiding details that might invite further speculation. The reality of what was happening began to sink in as they discussed the logistics of Catherine's physical departure from the palace. Arrangements had been made for her to stay with her parents temporarily, allowing her the space she needed while keeping her close enough for regular contact with William and the children. The thought of leaving the home she had shared with William and their children was almost unbearable for Catherine. Every room held memories of their life together, from the children's first steps to quiet evening conversations. The palace had become more than just a residence. It was where they had built their family and their life together. William struggled with his own emotions about Catherine's departure, balancing his support for her decision with his sadness about the changes it would bring to their daily life. The thought of waking up without her beside him, of eating meals alone, and of handling parenting decisions without her immediate input was overwhelming. As they held each other that night, both Catherine and William knew that they were facing one of the most challenging periods of their marriage. The love between them remained strong, but the practical realities of their separation would test that bond in ways they had never experienced before. The final preparations for Catherine's departure were completed with careful attention to security and privacy concerns. Her personal belongings had been packed discreetly, and arrangements had been made for her transportation to her parents' home without attracting media attention. The following morning would bring the official announcement and the beginning of a new chapter for both Catherine and the royal family. While the future remained uncertain, Catherine felt a sense of relief at having finally taken control of her situation, rather than allowing circumstances to continue overwhelming her. As she drifted off to sleep in William's arms for what might be the last time for many months, Catherine allowed herself to hope that this difficult decision would ultimately lead to healing and renewal for everyone involved. The path ahead was unclear, but it represented a choice made from strength rather than surrender. a decision to prioritize well-being over appearances, and a commitment to creating a sustainable future for her family.